presented my lecture much better than I possibly could before this time. What I want to deal with tonight is a much different scale, and that is the scale of the building itself. And the spirit that we're going to be dealing with is a different kind of spirit. It really is the spirit of the times as it affects buildings and its reflection on society. Architecture is an inescapable expression of the period in which it was built. There's no question about who ruled Egypt. In fact, there's very little left of anything of the way in which people lived at that period. The hovels or even the greater houses are gone, but the pyramids are there, and it represents the absolute power of the pharaoh. I think it's the clearest expression of the societal structure that you could possibly have. It also is a reinforcement of the point I was making about monumentality. These buildings are built at their angle of repose, and so they didn't need any structural props to keep them going. They are the structural form. If you were simply to pile the stones there without regard to the buildings as a piece of architecture. Of course, from the 9th or 11th century until about the 16th, perhaps, there was no question either of it dominated society and its structure, at least in Europe. The cathedral, the church, in its scale, in its dominance, in its position, clearly represented the power of the church of the period. And there isn't any doubt about where the power lay. Today, that is in the 20th century, I think there is no question about where the power lay, and that's in the banks. It's very clear where society puts its money, literally and figuratively. And so that represents the 20th century. What represents the 21st century? So the question on this one, and that's a serious question, I'm not joking entirely. If you go in, you've read the Cahill's Hinges of History, and he deals with the origins of the Abrahamic religions when it breaks from the notion that it's absolutely inevitable, the cycle of nature, the cycle of man, life, death, to an introduction of the individual. And the individual, particularly in the Jewish and Protestant faiths, not so much in Catholic and in Muslim, you are your own interlocutor with God. There's nobody stands between you and God. You make your deal with it. In fact, you can even wrestle with the angel Gabriel. That's how close you can come to dealing with deity. And that individualism, in my humble view, is actually what's developed the West the way it is, with its entrepreneurship, its individuality, its initiatives, its private enterprise notions. But taken to the extreme, when in fact it doesn't deal with the community of the aggregate, of a common interest, where you have individualism overweening itself, as you have in the United States to a large degree, and I think if Mr. Harper would have his way, we would have it here too. Not everybody in the room, I suppose, would agree with that. But I think that this notion of the individualism is in fact a destruction of society, and it's represented in architecture. That this is extreme individualism. There's no attempt at the aggregate. There's no attempt at seeing the common good. It's the me generation expressing itself completely. And it has to go to extremes in order to do that, because each time you do something exotic and extraordinary, you've got to go one better. You do something even worse. It's an interesting idea too. I said this to a few people we had supper dinner with tonight. Ideologues and amateurs have the same approach. Both come with preconceptions. They don't work it out on the ground. They don't think about the larger context. And in fact, there's an apocryphal story about Mies van der Rohe by a student who said to him, "Mr. van der Rohe, how would you design a building in the Arctic?" And he said, "Met steel and glass." "How would you do it in the desert?" "Now met steel and glass." "Mr. van der Rohe, isn't there a difference?" "Yeah, a question of proportion." Well, it isn't a question of proportion. It is a question of context and technology. So let me just show you architecture without architects, with limited means, what the response is. In a hot, wet climate, where this diurnal range from night and day is very small, you cool by breeze. And in hot, wet climates, vermin are abundant. So you put the building up on stilts, you have a thick thatched roof to keep the rain off, the heavy rain, and you open it to the breeze. And it's the perfect response to climate. In a hot, dry climate, with the brilliant sun at a high diurnal range, very cold at night, very hot in the daytime, these thick walls warm up slowly and cool slowly. And the glare is intense. Buildings without artificial lighting or air conditioning are like the iris of the eye. Look at the windows of the 18th century in Holland and in Scotland. Enormous windows, not a great deal of sunlight, lots of low cloud. In more temperate climates, you could have much bigger windows. But in the desert, the glare is intense, the coolness of the building inside, and what's more, in the tropics there are lots of trees, in the desert there aren't. So you build with mud, there's not much stone, and you can use flat roofs because there's not much rain. You can dry your pumpkins up there. So the fact is that this is another brilliant response with minimal effort. And what is this? The most perfect response of all. Ice which will kill you is here to protect you. And the form that it gets built is the simplest way. The structural engineers recently made an analysis of, it's not a hemisphere, it's actually slightly parabolic. If it was a hemisphere, for those of you engineers, you know there'd be tensile forces as well as compressive forces, and it would collapse under wind. With this form of construction, they're all compressive forces. It's like an arch. The greater the pressure, the stronger the resistance, because you're forcing the materials together. Same as this, the high winds of the Arctic, the thickness of the ice, and the complete protection from the elements made with what would otherwise kill you. And in nature, the most amazing economies, of course both the things I've been talking about have immense economy, but these are not in man-made components. It's been recently analyzed that the thread of the spider, we have not yet reached the tensile capacity in steel that the spider produces in this. All your sea creatures, what's interesting about all of that for me is that the forces they're resisting are huge. The amount of material they use is minimal. The response is exquisitely where it's required. It's hard for an architect to get a cantilever like that. It's the most amazing cantilever. Look at the length of that beam, if you like, and its connection, which is small. And you realize what an amazing thing of a continuity of fiber can give you. Now, the most interesting entrance exam I ever went through was at graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, where they had an engineer by the name of Larkin-Stuart, wonderful French engineer, brilliant engineer, actually invented double curvature. And his exam was, and everybody wanted his course, he said, okay, I'm going to take 20 people, about 100 people wanted to get in, and the exam was this. He had a skeleton hanging on a scale in the room and said, tell me what you see. What do you see? Well, look at that. That skeleton is about 15% of the weight that it carries. The weight of that skeleton, probably 15 pounds for a 100-pound person. So the structure that's bearing it is minimal. What else do you see? You can't see it here, but all those joints, because it's hanging, are actually wired together. The structure is good in compression, but not in tension. And what else do you see? In terms of response to forces, look how the joints thicken. Minimal structure here, maximal structure there is required. Where the vital organs are, the structure is actually protective. So the response of that skeleton in its economy and its exquisite response in the amount of material it uses is another wonderful example. And in architecture, this building, done by Buckminster Fuller, is an expression of the least amount of material and the least amount of surface enclosing the greatest volume. So it's a brilliant example of, not in natural forms, but in man-made forms to do that. And an attempt I made because in a world in which we are consuming 1.5 times of what the earth produces, whether it's in minerals or woods or whatever, we have an obligation, but I think we have a professional obligation to use the least amount of material possible. And this is an attempt to do so in a bridge I did for some lights, where there's very small amounts of steel and a minimal amount of surface. Compare it to this. And I'm not going to criticize the architecture, it speaks for itself. But this is 12 times the amount of steel you use in a normal building. It's an ideologue with a preconceived notion. It's much praise for writing this little sketch on a napkin. That's its problem. It's not something that's worked out from the structural requirements, but from a preconception about form. Whether the form fits the use and function in Denver or here is relevant. So moving to historical examples, here is a form of structure, a prop, that is holding up a retaining wall, because the turning moment of that retaining wall with the wind and the earth behind it, especially if it rains, is enormous. So during construction there are these temporary props. If you celebrate the absolute necessity, the secret of design, in my view, is making a virtue of a necessity. That's where you get authenticity. These are props, but look how they celebrate it over time. They've become things of exquisite beauty, but they're just a structural form. And more importantly, it's not like you could compose where the windows go through idiosyncratic positioning and artistic sensibility. They come because they're between the structural components. And the issue was, if you look at the Norman churches, walls 20 feet thick. Cost a lot of money to do that in order to resist the forces of the arch. And so you want to minimize the amount of material, and that's why you've got the buttresses. But the walls between are heavy. What's the perfect way to lighten that wall? Make it of glass. So the window's position is inevitable. It's that inevitability that gives, in my view, extreme authenticity to it all. Of course, the Abbé Sugar of Saint Denis was supposed to have invented the Gothic form. The fact of the matter is, I am sure that he went to the Alhambra. It's where the origins of Gothic can be seen. It's the Berber Arabs who really invented the Gothic form. The Alhambra, for me, it was an epiphany when I first went there and thought, well, yes, Abbé said, I don't trust him. He went on a trip, came back, and he had that epiphany, but he'd seen it. He'd seen it at the Alhambra. But for me, the extraordinary beauty of the stonemasons, of minimizing the strength of the walls, and in fact exaggerating that by these small corrugations. So its elegance, its verticality is entirely consistent with the notions of the spire, the pointed arch, pointing heavenwards. But in essence, it's an architecture of authenticity because its windows go where you don't want heavy walls, and its structure is celebrated. Changing the subject entirely to looking at also the ways in which colonial architecture responded to the tropics. Big roofs, verandas for shade, and openness for breeze, although they didn't do a lot of it in terms of openness. They lived life differently. And I was faced with this site and picking up on the ways in which colonial architects did it. I built a big roof, big verandas, and because it's in a hurricane zone, I took the rafters and crisscrossed them so that they become bracing to to resist wind forces of 120 miles an hour or more. And those become decoration. So instead of just rafters, they are in fact a structural form. And these, to get them right out of the way, are sliding folded louvers, so at night they can come down and make a room. But during the day, it's an entirely open pavilion. And of course, the verandas are where you live, in the tropical isles. Similarly, in this building, stepping down, a very difficult site, but making use of the roof. There's no groundwater on this island, so the roofs have their beams bent upwards. So the decks do something very important. They shade the concrete slab below it. What you want to do in the tropics is to get ventilation and shade. So these become useful decks, but they're also the collectors. They're the systems of collecting water and openness entirely. In windy places, what you want is some still spot away from the wind to create an enclosure that is calm. And so this is a courtyard in a circumstance of high wind that produces that calm. I showed you this yesterday, and I did talk about one of the more intriguing things for me is when you have absolutely opposing and apparently irreconcilable demands. When I was commissioned here, the engineer had produced an L-shaped building, and the Damascus Gate was off to this side, which is Arab Jerusalem, and this side is Jewish Jerusalem. And I said to them, don't you think it's a bit odd? This is not a state building, it's a municipal building, it's a city hall. Shouldn't it be accessible to all the citizens of Jerusalem? And Trinity College, the wonderful mayor at the time, said, you're absolutely right, but we've got this planning permission from them. I said, why don't we scrap it? He said, they'll take a year to get it through. I said, in 20 years' time, who the hell will care when it took another year? He said, you're right. We might have done it less than a year. But the way in which, on the other joke in Jerusalem used to be that there is a space outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There is the Temple Mount, but for the Jews, there was no place to have a political protest. If you wanted one, you had to go to Tel Aviv. So we had to create a square in which they could protest. And so this is the plaza. And the irreconcilable or conflicting uses were most great squares have fantastic definition. They are outdoor rooms, essentially. Just think of the great piazza that you know in Europe. So how do we get a square which has definition, but is permeable by a pedestrian on all sides? So the way I accomplish this, I think, is that on the Arab side there's a band shell you can walk through, and on this side there's a palm grove that helps define it, and not a very new idea, a hanging garden on that side. It's been done in the Middle East before. And the city hall is here, and then these walks that go through from a closed space to an open space to a slightly wider space, and then you're presented with the entranceway in a sequence. That's part of the historic building I kept. Tsar Nicholas II, these are Armenian buildings, and the aqueduct I reintroduced. Now, the aqueduct no longer flowed, so symbolically I put an Archimedes screw in here, cascaded it here to give unity to this otherwise rather heterogeneous collection of buildings. And so that's when you arrive at the final spot. This is an early picture. These are now covered with planting. And that's the band shell where you can walk around and through, and the palm grove on the other side. And then capturing views so that the historic is brought into it visually. There's framing the view of the Tsar Nicholas II building through the colonnade of the city hall itself. And the aqueduct coming through the garden, and the Archimedes screw. And the sound of water, of course, in the Mediterranean in a hot, dry climate is always so wonderful. So having water cascade to get that sound of it is something that in the public square is very satisfying. Another building in the same context with opposing requirements. That's the these are the Parliament buildings, that's the Supreme Court, the two great buildings of state. And these were the bureaucracy around here, the Treasury and other sorts of buildings. The embryonic beginnings at this stage through the ceremonial route of an enclosure of that space eventually. And we were given this site here to build the foreign ministry. We wasn't given it, it was a competition which we won. And so the question was, foreign ministry for a state such as Israel is more important than anything else. That's an existential question, foreign relations. And so how do you put a building that has more significance than the others, but helps to, in fact, continue the enclosure of the more important buildings yet? And the way that was accomplished was to have this part of the building absolutely conform to that continuity, but make the roof of a different geometry sitting above it so that you're getting both and rather than either or. And the other aspect of this, which is difficult, is that unlike many American embassies that their protection is so obvious that they become bunkers. How do you get a building for a democratic country that's representative of an openness and yet it's totally secure? And in this building we actually have a situation room that can withstand atomic attack, and you could exist in there for 10 to 14 days without any help whatsoever. So it had to be extraordinarily secure. And not to look like a bunker. Partly it was done with, and it's a different problem designed for a Canadian architect. How do you make garbage boxes that are bomb-proof? It's not a problem I have in Toronto to deal with, but those are the kind of issues that you don't think about, have to deal with. So earth forms landscape to keep people remote rather than the concrete blocks. And then sort of like a gateway across the roof of the ballroom, which became like a ruin, half sunk in orangery. And then the most difficult problem of all, I had different entrances for the foreign minister and for the diplomatic staff. And they said to me, you can't do that. It's a democratic country, everybody comes through the same door. And I said, well, what happens if you're entertaining the Chancellor from Germany and everybody's coming to work? He said, that's your problem. So the solution to that was to create a central piece. By and large, this is the foreign minister's suite and press and so forth. This is the diplomatic corps offices. But this central piece here was the gathering place. And the solution was that everybody comes into that but at different levels. So the staff or the workforce come in here at this level into that collecting place. And the minister comes in here. This is, of course, a secure courtyard for convoys of cars that come and bringing in diplomats and so forth. And we had to design this one so that there was no point in the landscape around it that you could actually get a sniper shot in. So you can see here the different geometries. The lower geometry conforming to the enclosure at ground level, and the roof at a very different geometry. You can see the geometry of the roof more clearly. And here is the ballroom. This is an early picture, the orangery is just planted. And then using onyx so that in the daytime, the golden light of Jerusalem would shine into this reception hall where people would be received, and at nighttime it would have the reverse effect. And so that's it in the daytime. And again, another virtue of necessity. We designed, the first time we designed this building with it's just about 1.25 inches thick onyx. Anything unusual they take out into the desert and test with a bomb site. And the first one we failed horribly. And they said you would have killed the whole diplomatic corps. Everything would have gone off. So we went back and designed it with the notion, it occurred to me that cannons recoil. When they fire, they recoil. They'll give them that the ability to accept the blast. So each one of these panels has a spring clip behind it, so that the blast it would receive the blast and then fall outwards. But if it didn't work, this tick screen would take shrapnel that came through after that, but it became a decorative element. While it's glazed and very light, it still is in a hot climate. So above that there is a brise-soleil or an umbrella. And of course, unlike the ideologue that makes the buildings the same on every side, this is facing west. And the west light is where you get the highest heat gain. So these enclose small courtyards where diplomats could go outside and have conversations without fear of being bugged. Because in fact bugs are now so sensitive that if you speak in a room and the glass vibrates, somebody with a sensitive device can pick up a conversation. So you could have conversations here out indoors in these courts that became protectors of the Western life. Back to some familiar ground. Again, another problem. How do we have a building that is consistent with the street continuity of Toronto, but it's an opera house? How do you get this to, in fact, become more special than the buildings and its surroundings? And we have another problem here, technical one, which I found interesting. The lower the sound penetration into a building that you produce music, the greater the appreciation of the music. So the quieter the room, the better your reception. Fairly straightforward logic. But we have a subway right here. As you know, Toronto is blessed with a wonderful subsoil condition that carries sound marvelously. And so we had to deal with that question. So, both aesthetically and technically, the auditorium itself is isolated from the surrounding building. This building here, this component, within it doesn't actually touch the exterior. I don't have a section here. I should have brought that, but the whole of that is one concrete shell that sits on grade. Actually, it's kind of, in a way, a Canadian technology. They're huge hockey pucks, actually. Huge blocks of rubber that are sliced with steel. And they are vertically and horizontally separated. So there's actually an expansion joint around here. And architecturally, these are protective components, almost like an egg in a nest, that it's sitting delicately in the center, protected but also expressed architecturally. And so you get glimpses as you come down the street of a fairly austere building, with all of the components, the fly tower unashamedly shown and so forth. And then the capturing of the sidewalk, as I said, to make it, last night, to make it absolutely visible, that you see people gathering. There is a sense of occasion. There is the excitement of what's going on. Complete transparency. But then inside, and as the Ariel Amphitheatre, as I mentioned, has helped gain popularity. But the whole idea of staircases as part of the ceremonial aspects of moving through a place elegantly, of seen and be seen, of the exuberance of making a staircase, which is, of course, really a utilitarian thing, changing levels, to make more of it than simply stairs, to make grand escalier. So the play of that stairs is a very traditional thing. And then there is some fun with glass stairs and wooden stairs and so forth. And making them as delicate as possible. It was, until I did the Mariinsky, the longest glass staircase in the world. But again, let me point out how the structure works. An I-beam, the real strength in an I-beam is the top and bottom flange. The web in between is simply keeping them apart. You can actually drill holes in the web of an I-beam and not affect the structure. That's the neutral axis. The top's in compression, the bottom's in tension, nothing in the neutral axis. So this rail is the top flange, that's the bottom flange, and the glass balustrade is just keeping those apart. So that is actually an I-beam. And of course there's fun with it. You can see people moving through. And then inside this, that's the egg. Then once you've moved from the part of your life in the city, the gregarious activity where in fact the audience are the performers, in the intermission to come into here where the focus is obviously on the stage, and you go into a world where belief is suspended and you can enjoy music. And we have achieved here N1 rating. That means that there's no sound in this auditorium from the outside that will penetrate this that's audible to the human ear. Absolutely N1 rating. And there are, just for those of you who might be interested, two kinds of ways that sound is transmitted. One is airborne sound, like me talking to you here now, and there is structural borne sound. When you put your ear to a rail, if you have a train a long way away, the bad neighbor upstairs hitting this concrete carries through. So structural borne sound is, you get attenuation of that through mass. Airborne sound is absolutely through structural discontinuity. So you need both. You don't want any vibration coming through, and you can get that, and we've obviously used both. Another form of spirit of place, this is a vineyard in Niagara, where clearly the landscape is so extraordinarily linear. And to make a building fit that in a kind of harmonious way, in fact this is the only organic vineyard in Canada that I used, and you need a marker. Most of the vineyards have rather garish markers and signs. This is a simple glow wall that runs the length. The parking lot is here, but we drain it into a swale in which all the impurities of the car that are runoff is purified through the swale before it goes into the conservation system. And then, in a very contemporary manner, the roof overhanging that, defining the space but very loosely. And of course there is the whole question of surprise and anticipation. I mean, it's a little bit like the half-clothed figure is much more exciting than a nude figure of its own. I mean, there's no surprise, there's no anticipation, so to speak. So here the wall, when you come from the parking lot, there's one aperture. On the other side, it's completely glass, so that you're part of the vineyard. And you can see that's the glass side of it, and that's the wall side of it. I'm actually drawing you on there. And to, I think, the one last component of the talk, the issue here was in Russia, in St. Petersburg, as I talked about tonight, last night, is how to get continuity of the streets and give specialness. This is the new Mariinsky, occupying a whole block. This is an enormous building. In Canada, or most North America and Europe, people can't afford to make the sets on the site. They're made in some cheap industrial building on the edge of town. All of the production of the old Mariinsky and the new one with the bridge connecting are going to be made here. The Four Seasons has 3 stages: main stage, rear stage, and one side stage. Munich, standard bearer of the 19th century houses, has 4 stages: main stage, rear stage, and 2 side stages. We have 6 stages here. We have 3 rehearsal rooms, and then there are minor ones: one for chorus, one for ballet, one for orchestra. Because the Russians understand, as few do, how important the arts are to their sense of self-esteem, they understand that it's hugely important for their country. And the tradition, of course, is very strong. It's wonderful going to the opera and seeing teenagers on young late teens on dates. It's really quite superb. And of course, sitting on my shoulder is this over here is Rachmaninoff, and this is Grieg and Mozart. And so you have all of these antecedents sitting. And there'd be no opera house built since the Tsars when we began this. So it was a big issue for the Russians. And what I have attempted to do is, because this is the iconic Mariinsky, that's the great Conservatory of Music. Currently there's this little park here and some trees here next to Glinka and Rachmaninoff's statues. But we were building across the canal, Grioka Canal. And so the attempt was, as in the Place du Vosges, the way in which that works is a surface that's complete building to building. There's no sidewalk with a curb and then a street. It's one level. You separate the cars from the pedestrians simply by bollards. So my proposal, and this part has not yet been built, was to in fact create one floor right across. And because December Street is such a busy street, I put the entrance to the Opera House here, and in order to unite it, we'd have an avenue that would cut across it with a new pedestrian bridge, with this terminating the vista, as we talked about last night. And that's going to be built. All of the rest is being done, but the master plan for this area has not been placed. And here you can see it. This is the old Mariinsky, this is the conservatory, and that's our building site. St. Petersburg, rather like Venice, has not got much ground support below us. It's marshland, swamp. So we had to go down a very long way to get down to sufficient length of a friction pile to hold up the building. And it is an enormous building. It's about 900,000 square feet. It's an enormous building. But the Opera House itself is, of course, quite small. And as I said, I wanted to get this building one that would be part of the street continuity and yet have some specialness. Traditional architecture there, to repeat myself from last time, masonry base, vertical windows, metal roof, and a portico to show you where the entrance is and to relieve the continuity of the facade. So we've got a masonry base, vertical windows but syncopated, a rather more exuberant roof, and then bay windows to indicate where the entrances are and to relieve the facades. So that's it there. And the reason that I think we've accomplished both is that this is absolutely in scale with of the continuity of the street. But the exceptional quality is that you can look into it and see the egg of the auditorium that I've coated encased in onyx, background onyx. We had to find onyx in Iran, India. It wasn't enough in one country to do this. So just to explain how this works, again, to create a sense of occasion, to have fun, to see people at different levels, most importantly, democratically, to give the topmost level the same benefits and amenities as the bottom. The different culture, there's a big deal about arriving with coats and boots, although St. Petersburg's climate, surprisingly, is not that different to Toronto. Perhaps more changes in the temperature, but the extremes are about the same. Differences because it's so far north, it's about Yellowknife, that you get in the summertime. The sun almost doesn't sink. And that's why I built an aerial amphitheater for summer performances in the evenings, where you could look out on the cityscape, the roofscape of St. Petersburg. But the point about the garderobe down here, escalators down, boots and coats off, straighten yourself out in your finery, escalator up, and then you have a choice. A glass staircase, double-leg staircase, a helical staircase, or the elevators. So, and there is the room isolated from the remainder. The emphasis on the glazing on this side for two reasons. For the entrance, but also to give you views of the old Mariinsky. And so you can see the play of escalated stairs. And most importantly, in terms of disability, here's a point. You can always get somebody who's disabled in a wheelchair up the freight elevator. The key to it, in my view, true equivalence, is to give the disabled something that the abled would choose out of preference. So that this ramp that's here will be chosen because people like to use it, and therefore there's not a second-class quality to that disability. I think that I could get away with more austerity in North America, in Canada, and in Europe than I was pushed, obviously, to do gilt and plush and so on. But this is the amber room, famous amber room that was looted looted by the Nazis and is being reconstructed in Sasko Selo, the summer palace of the exiles. So taking that as a principle, what I did was to use the onyx to accomplish several things. Number one, to give identity to the separation of the auditorium. So you read the auditorium as a volume. You can see it from the street, so it's not an ordinary building. But it also is an acknowledgement of a different taste. So that this is the onyx wall, this is the helical stair, that's the ramp. And that has actually worked out. And above the glass stair there's a skylight. But that use of that material has really resonated. That's not a pun. Resonated well with the audience, and that's the roof with the protection, and that's the amphitheater. And you can see St. Isaac's Cathedral. And if you turn around, that's the old Mariinsky right here. And then there's St. Nikolai, one of the most beautiful. I don't know if ever you've been into a Russian church in which the Orthodox choir with a basso profundo was singing. Actually gives me chills. It's extraordinary. I used to go and listen to that, and I don't know what it is, but they get to it. So the final part of this talk tonight is coming back to Canada. This is the Maison Symphonique in Montreal, and I've deliberately had photographs of it done in the snow. Most architectural renderings are young people in the sunlight, always perfect. So I think it's important to recognize, and that's why, in this instance, I've taken the volume of the house through the roof, aesthetically, visually, not acoustically. And it's that room, that's that piece that gives it warmth, that you can read the volume. And behind, these are the change rooms and other kinds of rooms. These are the public rooms. And this piece here, which at night is not as visible, and when we took that, it had not been installed. This is now an art installation of glass pieces that are at the end of Maisonneuve. There's a street here, but that's the end of the vista. So it gives the building its connection to the landscape. The interior is wood, as you can see, beech. And I had the great pleasure of designing the organ. Most organs now look to me like radiators. But this is a contemporary organ. And so I wanted to find a freedom to use it as freely as I could. But again, in virtue of the necessity, what you try to do in an auditorium is to refract the low, medium, and high frequencies. Now, low frequencies are refracted by big differentials in plane, medium ones, and then the high frequencies are differentiated so slight it's like sandpaper. So these are the medium plaster insets. These are the large ones. You can see the very big booms. And then these planks have got varying finishes. Some feel like sandpaper, some are as smooth as silk. And so the whole, although this is not symmetrical, in fact it's very much played up as a composite, is unified by one material, so that you have unity in that diversity, and that gives you that sense of comfort and accomplishment, that it's not jarring. And I'm just going to finish on my most recent pet project, which is the organ. Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful, and I'm sure that Mr. Diamond will be happy to take questions. Yes.
Well, I hope it didn't strike you too loud. I actually think it's done by Renzo Piano, who's a brilliant architect whom I have a great deal of admiration for. And I think it's actually a very fine building.
Is that all you're going to say?
What more do you want me to say? No, I think what's interesting about the building, it isn't simply a slab. It is composed in shards and components as it goes up. And yeah, I suppose the difficulty is how far do you go before it becomes willful? That's a very delicate line. I think Renzo Piano has the capability of doing it so it's just short of that line. But it can become too playful, too whimsical, and in fact, if you design it from the inside out, it becomes very difficult to subdivide for different sized tenants. That's the problem of an office building. How do you accommodate a variety of sized tenants? How do you give them equal amenity? You know, if you're going to do, as you've seen in some buildings, where the structures on the outside, they grade crosses, who gets the office just where the crosses intersect? That's a consideration. I think without knowing the building, by having visited, I've seen it from the outside, I've not been through it, I've walked by it, and it looks like a fine object. Whether it works for every tenant, I don't know. And therefore that's the question of the balance between its form and its utility. That's an important distinction. And I won't make a judgment about that because I don't know.
An architect can design a theater from a setting or a functional point of view. An acoustical engineer is concerned about the actual quality of the sound. How do you harmonize those two elements?
Well, just to tell you, boast you, I suppose, about my long interest in music and performing arts, my bachelor thesis was a concert hall in acoustics. So I know enough about acoustics to know I need a good acoustician. And I know how to work with them. I think the important point is, and I'll confide in you a story with the Opera House. We hired, I didn't hire him, but what's his name? Great acoustician, Russ Johnson, was retained. And I said to Russ, I want to work with you, but you have to tell me the principles of the requirements so that I can design them. And he said, yes, 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 we'll do that. And then he began to say, this is what we'll do. And I said, Russ, what's the principle? He said, I've done it lots of times and it works. Well, for other reasons just on that, we let him go. And I wrote an acoustician who did explain the principles, and we did work in an interactive manner. That, in fact, I wanted the ceiling at some points to, in fact, have wider gaps. That didn't work, so we figured out to curve the ceiling so we'd have the narrower gap, but I'd still have the form I wanted. So it was an interaction between principle and application. And that's a wonderful collaboration, and that's where the creative process happens. Not with a preconception, but with making a virtue of a necessity. Like the sides of the walls are great like a basket weave of convex shapes. That's for the low frequency refraction. Once I knew that, then I could design to it. But I didn't want somebody to give me a solution to something that he'd done before. There's no creativity in that. Yes?
When you're designing a complex building, how do you manage the sheer number of drawings that you have to produce to give guidance to all the people that are setting out the facilities?
It's not as difficult as it sounds. First of all, I have lots of good help. Wonderful, the people that my firm are exceptionally wonderful people who are dedicated in a way that's really inspiring. But I think once you've got the main theme, and it develops slowly, it's almost, I mean, the analogy would be a sculptor. There's the block, and you block out the form, and then you begin to chisel it, and then you polish it. So I think it is not unlike that, in which if you could turn that light out, actually, we don't need to see this all the time. Would you mind turning the projector off? Hi, could I turn the projector off? so then once it's blocked out, it goes through the phases, first of the schematic design, which has not much detail, but in fact has all of the volumes and places, positions, position wells, section, and so forth. And then there's the design development drawings, when you begin to put in the systems, select the envelope assembly, and develop all that, rejecting many, you go through that process. Once that's done, the construction documents are actually mechanical. After that, I think many architects don't come to this realization quickly enough. The schematic design is for the architect to communicate with himself. The design development drawings are to communicate with the client, but still on a design basis. The construction drawings are to communicate with the contractor. They're absolutely a language of instruction to the contractor to how to build it. And so, technically, that's got to be well coordinated. What helps now is that there are computer programs that we now use that do construction drawings in 3 dimensions, so that you can run interference about mechanical, electrical systems and structural systems and coordinate them on the drawing in 3 dimensions. It's quite wonderful. That's it.
So, I'm a
Sorry, there's one question.
One last one. Common heritage, South Africa. Any ideas from South Africa taken with you through your career, architectural ideas? And I think of our University Jameson Hall, Set Against the Mountain. I think of Herbert Baker, his architect at the time. Any thoughts you built your career on?
Herbert Baker was a wonderful architect, and one of the great architectural styles, if I could use that much denigrated word, in the world that is well not understood as Cape Dutch architecture. Cape Dutch architecture was an amalgam of the Huguenots, who came from France bringing viticulture, and the Dutch with the gable, and the amalgam is extraordinary. You have these whitewashed buildings, starting at about 1692, all the way through to the 19th century. They sit in a very rugged landscape, and they put a white wall to define the place. That the yard of the chateau, what would be called a chateau in France, but these vineyards, and the whitewash is phenomenal in reflecting its Mediterranean climate, very crisp. There is exquisite shadow patterns. In fact, one of the first lessons you do in Cape Town, you have to understand the difference between shade and shadow. And so you get reflected light off the floor, as you do in Greek architecture, that graduates the shade, goes from light to dark. So it has all of that play. And then the brilliance of the Cape Dutch building, let me just tell you this about virtues and necessities. There were thatch roofs, which were well good insulation, but they of course are flammable. They didn't have anti-flammable sprays in those days. So the ceiling on top of beams was made of clay brick, called a brandsolder, which means when the thatch roof burned, it fell onto the brandsolder and not into the house. And then the gable over the door meant it protected the front door when you were taking the furniture out when there's a fire from falling over the entrance. So the gable is actually a very brilliant device. And the front door, which was now known as a stable door made of 2 pieces, had a sash window above it, so you could open the top door and bring the sash window down so you had more light but still protection. So there are lessons to be learned in a brilliant architecture. And the way they sit in the landscape is thrilling. But I'm not answering your question. I thought it's an interesting example of this. The Cape Town School of Architecture was perfect training for the University of Pennsylvania because it was a mixture of Bauhaus and traditional training. It tells you how old I am and how different training is now. But we had to, first of all, make our own ink from Chinese blocks. We had to stretch our own paper. And I'll give you an anecdote of how heartbreaking it can be. It's the most beautiful surface to just work on. If you get a sheet of workman's paper and you roll it up and put it into a bath so it's completely evenly wet, then you lay it on a drawing board, and then you tape it down with brown strips of sticking paper. And as the paper dries, it stretches as tight as a drum. So you have this beautiful white surface that's as tight as a drum, and we use ruling pens. And you had to construct a Doric column with all of its detail and cast a shade on it, and then paint it or draw it and then wash it, wash the shade and shadow. And so I had 6 drawing boards set up to do all of these details. And I had wet the paper too much. In the middle of the night I heard, and I drafted everything out. I had it all ready to be painted. And these things split down the middle because I can't learn how to do it well yet.
So on that note, I would like to invite everybody to a reception after the lecture in the buttery. But before we do that, I would like to thank you, Jack, for 2 absolutely wonderful evening talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.